I stopped regularly attending worship services over 20 years ago when I became convinced that the modern sermon was less about teaching than a kind of performance art. Most attendees are consumers who are not there to learn, repent, and obey, but to get a spiritual experience that checks a box. And the design of the sermon-centered worship service too often reinforces this mentality. Sometimes I miss the corporate worship, but I just can't participate when the sermon is the main event. It does damage to my soul. But if you stop attending without a better alternative, sometimes this does even more damage. So here are 7 alternative gatherings I participate in on a rhythmic basis that have changed my life. So again, I want to unpack a little bit of that introduction, where I'm coming from there. So what does the Bible mean when it says church? So that the word church is the Greek word ekklesia. Ekklesia was a common word in Greek. I was reading a book recently that was not a Christian book at all, about ancient Greece, and that they were actually using this word multiple times. This was before Jesus, and they were describing, usually when you're reading literature like that, and in the first century as well, then the word ecclesia was used in a non-specifically Christian context, is talking about when the city or the village gathers, oftentimes in some kind of sort of decision-making or governmental capacity. So you would gather the ecclesia, the people would come together in this way to make decisions, or to have a gathering that's public. And so that's what we refer to. And so Jesus was making this really bizarre claim that he was going to build an ecclesia. It was like, what? You're going to build this governmental sort of gathering of people who follow you? Yes. So you're going to start to see emerge these people who are following me. They're going to begin to gather. And because he came to bring a kingdom, I do think that there is a governmental element to that. And that's why when Jesus used the word ecclesia, he said weird things like, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. He was talking about decisions when 2 or 3 you gather. All of that he described in Matthew 18. He also said in Matthew 16. I think he's referring to this. His kingdom has a particular expression on the earth, which is the gathering of his believers. And so those when they gather together, there's an authority. There's a kingdom authority that comes when his followers gather. And so there's a lot to that. Again, I'm not going to unpack all the implications of that. There's so much theology of this in the New Testament. Okay, so where does church fit into that? Well, if you read the rest of the New Testament, the word ecclesia is used about a third for 3 different kinds of like expressions within. So you always have to look at the context to figure out what it's talking about. So about a third of the time, the word ecclesia is referring to something that's happening in a house, right? So this is like in Romans 16, when it says, greet the church that meets in your house. Greet the ecclesia that meets in your oikos, in Greek. And so there is an expression of the church that's in the home, and that is based on a particular household. And so we practice that. We believe in that. We love that kind of ecclesia. That's about a third of the time. It's referring to a gathering that's happening in a small place like that, usually around a particular family and their extended household. Then you have about a third of the time it's referring to all the believers in a city, right? So all the letters in Revelation are this way, right? When Jesus, like, he's talking to the ecclesia in Laodicea, the ecclesia in Sardis, or when Paul is writing a letter to all the believers, the ecclesia in Ephesus, right? So about a third of the time, it's roughly referring to all the believers in a city. And that ecclesia could have multiple house gatherings, right? Multiple house ecclesia gathered in there. But that's about a third of the time. And about a third of the time, it's talking about all believers everywhere. When Jesus says, on this rock, I will build my ecclesia, he's not talking about a household or a particular city. He's talking about the universal church. Every believer, everywhere and at all times, is a part of the church. So now what's really tricky is that that's the way the New Testament uses the word ecclesia in those 3 contexts. When we use the word church, we almost entirely, probably 99.9% of the time, when we say the word church in our culture, we're not referring to any of those 3 things. That was what really kind of got me. The way you use language is important. So when we say the word church, hey, are you going to be at church tomorrow? Hey, they're building a new church at on Main Street. That's a very strange use of the word church. Never in the New Testament will you see the word used in that way. And what that is you're referring to something that's bigger than a household, but smaller than the city. And oftentimes, of course, referring to a building in particular. But even when it's referring to a group of people instead of a building, it's not referring to a household gathering or all the believers in a city or all the believers everywhere. It's really referring to a brand of like somebody has put a name, First Baptist of whatever, their name, some brand name over a group of people and said, that's a church. And so that's how we use the word. Now, if you ask me, are those expressions of the church? Yes. Yes, they are, I think, because again, Jesus said, when two or three are gathered, there I am in the midst. He's using the word ecclesia in that context in Matthew 18. So yeah, I think that when we gather in our house, it's an expression of the church. When the city gathers, it's an expression of the church. When First Baptist gathers, it's an expression of the church. I'm not taking that away from those particular branded versions or expressions of the church. My point is it's inappropriate to say that's an exclusive, like that people that gather in that way get exclusive rights to use the word church, and that every other kind of gathering doesn't get that right. Now that's something that people sort of intuitively believe, that I've discovered. People believe that, look, unless you're planting a church, and what they're really saying, and this gets all the way back to my introduction, is that a church must be centered on a worship service, and that worship service must be centered on a sermon. Now that I do take serious issue with being the exclusive use of the word church, because what you're referring to in that case is something that is man-made. It's a tradition. Again, I would grant that it's an expression of the church, but it's not an expression of the church that you're going to find in the New Testament anywhere. And so I do think it's optional as to, like, how do we interact with this thing? So to me, I think of it as a worship service ministry. In other words, there are people that feel really called to start a worship service and gather believers around their worship service. And at the center of that worship service, there's going to be a pastor, and that pastor is going to preach a sermon. And oftentimes the effectiveness of that church is going to be really determined by the quality of teaching. And that's why I began to realize that, man, this is starting to feel like a sermon-centered worship service is sort of a performance art. One that I personally, I just don't enjoy it. Like, I don't feel like I'm well taught by it usually. I've listened to some incredible sermons in my lifetime that have changed my life, but they are like 0.1% of the sermons. I have been in other teaching environments that have been way more effective at changing my life, at helping me grow, at helping me get closer to Christ. And so I just prefer other teaching, because I don't see that that's an version of the church like that. I don't feel like now I'm no longer part of the church if I don't center my life around a worship service that's sermon centric. I don't feel like I have to participate in that in some kind of regular basis. But if you don't have a better idea, then you certainly should do at least that. So I never discourage people from fully joining and participating in worship service centered churches. But I do want to present, there are alternatives. And certainly for the last 20 plus years, our family has been participating in those.